Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us this week from London, Bobby Ghosh, who is the Bloomberg opinion editor at Bloomberg Opinion. Bobby, wonderful to have you back. Also joining us from Washington, D.C. is Nahal Toosi, who is the foreign affairs correspondent at Politico. Nahal, great to have you. And also from London, Philip Stevens, chief political commentator of the Financial Times. Philip, wonderful to have you back as well. So much to talk about, Bobby. Let's start with the elections in Israel. The fourth election in 2 years, and the outcome is?
Very likely a fifth election to come. The outcome is completely uncertain. The one thing we can say for certain is that Prime Minister Netanyahu's effort to project himself as the great peacemaker in the Middle East and as the great manager of Israel's COVID response has not gone down very well with the electorate. His own party, the Likud, has actually lost quite a number of seats, from 36 down to 30. They need 61. They need a coalition of 61 seats in order to form a government. At the moment, his right-wing coalition only has 52. There is one other right-wing party that, if it joins this coalition, will bring it up to 59. And then, irony of all great ironies, Bibi Netanyahu, that great baiter of the Arabs, will depend on an Islamist Arab party's support if he can get it in order to form a government. So plenty of irony, no certainty.
Nahal, this is, I think, the first of these four elections in which one person in one country was not part of the discussion in Israel, and that's the United States. We remember the last time Netanyahu putting himself and Trump on every building. Biden is not part of the election campaign, and frankly, the U.S. stayed kind of out of that. Is that one of the reasons why Netanyahu may not have succeeded?
Well, it's possible, but it's also, when he did use Trump, he also had kind of the same results. And so I'm going to go ahead and predict now that there's going to be at least 10 Israeli elections. We can do it over and under if you guys want. But it also, isn't the definition of insanity doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result? But look, at the end of the day, I think that this is more about Netanyahu feeling like, as long as he keeps doing this, he will stay in power, perhaps stays, a bit further ahead of his legal problems. And I really don't know what it's going to take to have there be some sort of a break, unless you have some really new, party coalitions emerging or something like that. I'm open to any ideas, but to me, it just seems like this is just this endless merry-go-round.
What does this do to democracy? In the sense that if the core of democracy is elections in order to either reward or defeat a government, if we now have elections and the same government, or at least the same prime minister who dominates Israeli politics and has done so for 10 years, just remains, is faith in democracy going to be one of the casualties of this continuing deadlock in the Israeli political system? And you're muted.
I think it is. I think, especially as we've heard, when the prime objective of the present prime minister seems to be to stay out of jail, or at least to stay out of the courts, as it were. I think the question, it reminds me, Italy periodically has gone through these processes of the same fragmented parties and the same problem, and do you get to a position where, for example, Israelis say, look, we're going to have to change the electoral system? This is what happened in Italy. They moved to a system more likely to deliver majority. So that's one possibility. But whether that takes 4 elections or 10 elections to get to that position, or, the other thought I have is that, at some point there will be people in the Likud who say, okay, Bibi has had his chance, as it were, and if we keep doing this, we'll bring down the party as well as him. So I think there probably is a limit. On on the other hand, you could say, well, the electorate is being pretty stubborn in making the same choices over and over again. So, and that's democracy in the sense that, voters make the choices.
I think it's worth pointing out that the turnout was still pretty high, 67 something percent, down from 71, I think, in the last election. 60, I mean, most democracy in the world will take 67%. That's a very good turnout, despite the sort of tedium of it, and of course, COVID and concerns over that. It's really quite remarkable.
It's also worth noting that the Palestinians are going to be holding their own first election in 15 years soon, and that's an important marker as well.
Yeah, so let's broaden the picture a little bit away from the election to sort of this deadlock in Israel. What does it do for the regional situation, Bobby, in terms of on the one hand, during the deadlock, you've had a significant movement of agreements between Israel and a number of Arab countries over the past few years, and it seems to have no impact. On the other hand, the peace process there's no process. The prospect for peace between Israelis and Palestinians seems to be as far removed as it has ever been.
Yes, I think on the question of peace between Israelis and Palestinians, that's the one that's worth watching very closely. If the election, it's now looking pretty likely that the election in the Palestinian territories will wind up producing the same result at the end of it. And so if you have Mahmoud Abbas on one side and Bibi Netanyahu sort of clutching onto power, both of these sort of figures from ghosts of Christmases past sort of clinging to power, then there's not much room for optimism for any movement there. And the Abraham Accords will continue. I can imagine other countries being persuaded to join in, but the Palestinians will be left out and farther out in the cold if it continues.
I think the other thing is that certainly on the European side, no one is prepared to invest diplomatically in this. I mean, there was a time when European governments got really quite engaged and invested time and resources, trying to sometimes push the Americans, sometimes to push the Arabs or the Israelis. People now have just, I think, certainly in Europe, and I get the sense, it's in Washington likewise, people have just disengaged and said, look, there's nothing happening there. There's nothing we can do. So, we've got Syria, we've got Iraq, we've got, all these other problems. Let's just leave Israel, Palestine. So the time when it was sort of, everyone used to say, look, you can't solve anything in the Middle East without looking at Israel, Palestine first, has passed, I think.
And I would add that in Washington, it doesn't seem to be a high priority either for this administration. My understanding from what I can tell is they're not even talking about, say, appointing a special envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian issue or anything like that. They just don't see any prospects of real movement there.
So in that sense, maybe Netanyahu, who frankly doesn't want any movement when it comes to the peace process, is not only staying in power, but also achieving what he needs in foreign policy, where he is continuing to have reasonably good relations with the countries that have signed the Abraham Accords, and maybe, as Bobby says, can expand that and at the same time remain in power at home. I know that the only thing that the Biden administration has done is it has resumed aid to the Palestinians that the Trump administration has stopped. It's there, but I think Nahal's right. This is not high on the priority list in the Biden administration. So look, the one thing that Israel has done, and in some ways it's surprising that Netanyahu hasn't gotten the boost that one would have expected, is they've done an extraordinary job on the vaccination front, with over 50% of the population now completely vaccinated. For the rest of the world, we're getting great data from the Israelis, which was one of the reasons they were able to make that deal with Pfizer to get these vaccines and get them into arms. There are other countries that are doing okay. Certainly, the UK has rolled out vaccines well, and the United States is accelerating its vaccine program. But in Europe, it seems to have been about as big a mess as we have ever, as you could have possibly imagined. What's going on, and why did it go wrong?
Well, this is a complicated story, and it's got many threads, most of them sort of entangled with each other. So I'm going to try and keep it simple. But firstly, the European Union, or let's take Germany, France, Italy, but the European Union countries didn't spot early on that vaccination was the way to go. So while the UK and the US in particular were on the phone from really early on to the pharma companies and putting money in, the sort of slow motion sort of activities of the EU didn't push it forward. By the time, and this is, you're talking late summer last year, early autumn, the EU, it sort of dawned on the EU that this was moving fast. The whole process got locked in this, what we call precautionary principle sort of logjam, which is like, Europeans are really cautious about things. So again, while the UK had a fast track regulation system, I think so did the US, and the pharma companies were putting in information as they produced it rather than waiting. The EU took it slowly. And so, the UK, I think, was authorizing final tests, a month or two before and then finally the EU was slow to sign contracts. So as it's turned out, Europe is one of the biggest vaccine producing regions in the world, but the EU governments, or the EU itself, which is coordinating, doesn't have enough of these contracts to actually supply the governments. And then to complicate it even further, there's this argument, post-Brexit argument between Britain and the EU about supplies from one of the pharma companies, big pharma, AstraZeneca. The UK signed a contract, the EU signed a contract. The UK has been getting all its vaccines. AstraZeneca's been saying to the EU, well, we can't supply you because we're not producing enough. And that's caused huge tension between not just the EU and AstraZeneca, but between the EU and the British government. And so there has been and it's still there, we heard it even this morning, a threat from the EU that unless Britain allows exports of some of the AstraZeneca vaccine produced in the UK, then the EU might say, well, okay, the AstraZeneca produced in the EU will have to stay in the EU, which would badly disrupt the UK system. So it's vaccine wars, vaccine nationalism, whatever you want to call it. But I mean, a lot of it is just, the EU made the wrong calls early on and is trying to catch up.
Bobby, this disruption that we see in supply, India, now a huge supplier of AstraZeneca as well, has also decided that maybe we should vaccinate Indians first, just as in the US. The argument is we're going to use the production at home. It seems that the EU is of the rich countries. We're not even talking about the poor countries. Of the rich countries, seems to be the only one that has sort of failed to be nationalistic enough in order to keep this stuff for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting. The India example is quite interesting. India has, last I checked, exported more vaccines than it has used domestically. The gap is shrinking, and pretty soon they'll be consuming more at home than they send abroad. But still, very, very large numbers being sent abroad. It's not a very big political issue in India. You don't have political parties jumping up and down, opposition jumping up and down, questioning the government's policies or questioning the exports. Little bit, but nothing like what you're seeing in Europe and here in the UK. But, and this is a big but, the numbers are beginning to spike in India again after a very long time in which it had seemed that for some reason never adequately explained that India was doing well with the COVID numbers. They have suddenly, in the last 4 or 5 weeks, really taken off again. And especially in sort of important states, economically important states. So Bombay and the state around it, Maharashtra, has seen an enormous spike. So we'll see whether that changes the narrative, whether you begin to hear in India echoes of what you hear in Europe of people saying, why are we sending all these vaccines abroad when we have such a big crisis at home?
Nahal, the U.S. has some 30 million AstraZeneca dosage, I think, that have been produced in the United States. AstraZeneca has not been approved yet for use in the U.S., and the U.S. has plenty of vaccines from other vaccines to cover their own population. Why not just send those to Europe or indeed abroad? A little bit is going to Canada and Mexico, but why not just try to figure out a way to be helpful there? What's the administration saying?
I mean, my sense is that they probably will at a certain point, move to send more abroad. I think right now they just feel like politically it's still a little bit difficult. I mean, it's in certain parts of the country, it's still hard to get on a list to get a vaccine. I mean, my parents, they're both older. My dad is a stroke and a heart attack survivor, and like, it took forever to get him on a list. And I was lucky. Like, it was just like very much luck to get him on a list to get his first dose. So I just think still in the US, there's still areas and parts where like, if people were to, given especially the polarized politics of it, if Biden were to just say, oh, we're going to keep, we're going to start sending a bunch more out elsewhere to all these places, you're just risking like some political blowback. But I do think that given that things are getting a lot better, and that the numbers are improving, that in a couple of months, maybe even sooner, like we might see more of that export.
I think the logic as well everywhere is going to be, that it's no good, it's no good the UK being vaccinated and getting rid of it if the European continent has still got it, because what are we going to do? We're going to sit here all on our own. What's the good of having an airport if we're not going to allow anyone to fly into it, or our trade? And also, the more the virus flourishes elsewhere, the more likely it develops new variants, which the existing vaccines. So, but I don't think, as you say, Nahal, that politicians have got to the position yet where they can make that public policy case that getting rid of this virus, in that country, is helping ourselves as well as helping them. The other problem is, though, I mean, I normally take the EU side in most of the fights between the EU and the UK, because the UK is so bullheaded about Europe in general. But you have all these governments who are raising questions. On Mondays they're saying, well, we're not sure about this AstraZeneca, vaccine. Has it been tested properly? And what about the results? Then on Wednesday they're saying, well, Tuesday and Wednesday they're saying, but we want more of it. We want more. And there's the old joke of the person in the school refectory saying, "Isn't this food disgusting? And aren't the portions really small?"
Bobby, let's broaden this out from vaccines and sort of this. It seems to me that our first instance in the pandemic, the shortage of PPE, now the nationalism we're seeing on vaccines are raising some really big questions about the trading system and global supply chains and the ability to do just-in-time manufacturing that we've seen. And of course, now we have a ship in the Suez Canal that may be there for weeks. And last I read is 240 tankers are sitting on both sides of the Suez Canal waiting to get through just when these supply chains were already disrupted by the pandemic. Do you think there's a start where people are going to say, well, you know what, this globalization, this thing that we rely on foreign supply for everything isn't working? We need to think about more resilience into the system?
Well, that's the thing about these global supply chains. We pay very little attention to them until there is a choke point. And now I'm reading that coffee supplies are going to be cut out. So I'm drinking as much of it as I possibly can. Yeah, I mean, the Egyptians have widened the Suez Canal. Their plans to widen it even further. It just had to happen that this ship ran aground in the narrowest part of the canal. The chances of this happening, I wouldn't hazard a guess at the odds, but they would be very, very long. And yet here it is. It's happened. And suddenly everyone's woken up to the realization that for all that we live in the digital age and where data is the new oil, well, it turns out a lot of things still have to move in the traditional way. And there are these points around the world where the entire supply chain can be brought to a grinding halt. Whether this will spark enough enthusiasm for changing, adding another canal in the Suez for a start, will depend on how long this crisis lasts. We've gone from predictions of a day or two to a few days, and now to more than a week, certainly, and possibly 2 or 3 weeks. If this gets to the point where there is actually less coffee on the shelves in London, I'm also reading that toilet paper supplies may be disrupted. If that happens, if people see, or rather don't see these things where they're used to seeing them, then that might force policy changes. My fear is that what's more likely to happen is that there will be a lot of gnashing of teeth and jumping up and down and upset. But once the choke point has been cleared, after a few weeks of discomfort, we will go back to thinking as little as we possibly can about these things.
Philippa, is that how you see it? That inertia is likely to, the efficiency of the market when it works is going to be sufficient to overcome whatever disruption we've seen, even though in this pandemic particularly, we've seen the cost that this may have for people's lives.
I think the effect of the pandemic is going to live with us for quite a long time. And I think people, there genuinely will be, I mean, the word in security circles in Europe these days that everyone is using is resilience. And that's resilience not just against, the Russian threat or terrorists. I mean, that's resilience against sort of acts of or extraordinary events. So I think with this particular incident, I don't think it's going to live on, because I don't know. I mean, I know nothing about shipping, but I was reading that this is of a new generation of super container carriers that have got wider and wider and wider and taller and more difficult to steer. So I would have thought the sensible thing is that maybe those ships don't go through the Suez Canal and let all the the other 90% go through the Suez Canal. So I don't think there'll be a I did hear that the British government was offering the Egyptian government any help, and it made one think the last time the British were in Suez in 1956, it didn't end terribly well. So I suspect that we may hang back on this one.
I think the Dutch are sending their salvage crews in, as last I heard. But it's 20,000 containers on a 400-meter, 4 football field long ship. It's quite something. Now let's switch to Turkey. A lot happened in Turkey. I mean, a lot always happens in Turkey, but this week was a particularly busy week with Erdogan, who seems to be feeling the pressure of his population and reduced popularity, trying to retake the initiative with some pretty major domestic, in this case, sometimes it's foreign, but domestic changes. What happened this week, and what is the implication? What can we expect from it?
Well, several things happened, and I'm almost afraid I'm going to forget some. So if I do, just let me know. He basically sacked the head of the central bank, and that he did it because the guy wanted to hike interest rates. to lower the inflation problem. But Erdogan, believing he's an economic genius, just was like, no, that's not good. So he replaced him, and now he has his fourth central bank governor in 2 years. This led to a major crisis with the lira and the stock market, and foreign investors are once again like, you know what, maybe Turkey's not a great place to invest. So economically, there's a problem. He also announced that Turkey would quit the Istanbul Convention protecting the rights of women against violence. That, of course, caused even President Joe Biden to come out and issue a long statement just about how unnecessary that was. But Erdogan basically did this because he's trying to appeal to the traditionalists in his base who feel like these types of international conventions are, they go against the traditionalist family with the men in charge and all that stuff. And, that again was a sign of political weakness, right? If you're trying to shore up your base like that, then it's not a good sign in terms of your own popularity. And then also there's these ongoing disputes with Greece over the Eastern Mediterranean and maritime boundary lines over there. And you've had even France and other countries kind of line up on Greece's side on this. And this was all discussed during this EU summit that I think is still going on today, in which the discussion was, how to deal with Turkey. But because Erdogan has also made some moves that, assuage the Europeans' concerns, he's like, oh, we'll talk to the Greeks again, or we'll pull this vessel out of this area. The Europeans who, he sort of got them by the throat because of the refugee situation and his ability to control refugee flows into Europe. So the Europeans are like, okay, you know what, let's make nice again. Thank you for doing this. You're being cooperative again. And what's amazing to me is that he seems to keep being able to do this over and over with Europe, and they just fall for it every single time. So maybe someone who's allowed to have an opinion, unlike me, can weigh in on some of that.
Bobby, how do you see? I mean, there's a lot happening there, but do you see him to be on the defensive or on the offensive right now?
Well, he is definitely on the defensive, and may I commend Nahal for a masterful summation there of all the many things. I don't think you missed a single thing there. The big picture is this: he doesn't have to go to the elections for another 2.5 years, but all the indicators, economic and political, are pointing downward, and it looks like the betting in Istanbul and Ankara is that he will call for elections early in order to be able to win, because if everything goes the way it's going, his chances are going to decline every month, essentially. So if he is going to call elections early, he needs to make some very populist announcements and to, as Nahal said, shore up the part of the base that will be amenable to this kind of populism. And the safest thing to do is to appeal to the extreme right Islamist groups. And that's what he's doing with the Women's Convention. Ironically, it was the convention is not named Istanbul Convention by accident. It was a Turkish initiative in the first instance under an Erdogan government. But the hard right in Turkey are particularly agitated by some of the provisions in the convention, protections for minority groups, not just for women, but minority LGBTQ groups. And Erdogan, not coincidentally, in recent months, has been using more and more anti-LGBT rhetoric in his public speeches. So that is red meat to that base. On the other thing that he's going to need is the support of his party's traditional economic backers. So the entrepreneurial class in the Anatolian Peninsula, who basically finance his party. These are businessmen, small businessmen, and also large businessmen who have prospered under Erdogan over the years. They don't like high interest rates for obvious reasons. They're businessmen, and this is. And by trying to keep the rates down, he's trying to throw some red meat in their direction. The pain this will cause to the Turkish economy at large, he calculates that is going to be manageable. at least until the election takes place. Once the election takes place, things may change after that. But until now, until then, I think we'll see more and more of this sort of populism from Erdogan.
Philip, at the same time, the sort of the foreign policy and security implications seem to be growing as well, as Nahal mentioned. I think we had naval exercises with the French, the French, the Greeks, the Cypriots, and the Israelis together in the Eastern Med. Turkey has announced that it is going to perhaps buy even more S-400 air defense missiles from the Russians. And although Turkey is a member of NATO, at the NATO foreign ministers meeting this week in Brussels, even the Secretary General had some choice words for Ankara. Are we at a point where some really big fundamental decisions may be necessary to be made either by the EU or NATO or the United States, or frankly by Turkey?
Well, we should be at that point. I mean, the idea of a NATO member buying very sophisticated, anti-aircraft weaponry from Russia, it's just completely crazy. Or the idea of one NATO member, Turkey, threatening another NATO member, Greece, in the Aegean Sea. But as Nahal said, I mean, Europe is divided. You have, again, Merkel trying to keep everything under wraps, as it were. She negotiated the refugee deal with Erdogan a few years ago, whereby Turkey closed the borders to the Syrian regime refugees who were otherwise coming into Europe. France is very much on the more, on the side of Greece, and is pushing for much tougher action, and has been pushing the US as well. Now, the US, looks at it and says, well, on the one hand, and I think Tony Blinken actually said this week that there would be automatically more sanctions against Turkey were it to go ahead with this new order from. But on the other hand, it's the US has very important air bases in Turkey. Turkey, if you like, defends the southern flank of NATO. So how do you calibrate with someone like Erdogan, whose only purpose now is to stay in power? Everything and the regime does, and it's a regime now more than a government in Turkey, everything the regime does is basically about maintaining power. It's not about which policy is right. How do you deal with someone like that when, as he knows, you need him, or you need Turkey? NATO can't push out, the sort of backstop. And Turkey does a lot of stuff, for NATO as well. So, so I think we're going to have this awkward balancing act for some time. Erdogan's got quite used to playing people off and doing just enough to really annoy people, but not going beyond that to invite punitive responses. So I think I think it's going to be for the Turkish people. My only question is, with inflation now is 15%, I think, in Turkey. Now that's going to be hitting a lot of people in the big cities really quite hard. So I think there may come a point where, the cities and there are people in the AKP itself who are rebelling against Erdogan. So I'm not, I wouldn't say that his position within Turkey is entirely safe.
Nahal, what are you hearing in Washington from your sources in the Biden administration regarding their view on how to deal with this? There was a report earlier this week that the administration may, for the first time, recognize the Armenian genocide. If they were to do that, which is something that would terribly upset the Turks. One of the reasons it's never happened up to this point. Do you see the administration taking a more forceful position, or is it trying to do the same balancing act that, frankly, everybody else has been had to do, given the different balances and interest that the U.S. has here?
I don't think the administration is going to, in substance, take a much more forceful position or any kind of more forceful position. But in terms of perhaps some rhetoric, perhaps some diplomatic niceties. It might try to make it seem like it's punishing Turkey. To my knowledge, President Biden has not yet spoken to Erdogan, and that's quite the snub. At the same time, this president is very much aware that Turkey plays a significant role in a number of conflicts within the Middle East, from probably losing track now, Syria, and I think Libya. I mean, there's just so many. He's Erdogan's kind of become like an octopus, like he just has tentacles all over the region. And so from what I can tell, for this President Biden and his team, they're very practical about these things. I mean, recently, despite speaking tough about Egypt during the campaign, they went ahead and signed off on a $200 million arms deal with Egypt. So maybe they'll say more, maybe they'll mention human rights more, but will they actually do anything to substantively stress the relationship with Turkey? I wouldn't count on it. And in terms of the Armenian genocide, I want to make one thing clear. President Biden promised that he would support a resolution recognizing the genocide. And that's weird because you don't need a congressional resolution. So he didn't say, I myself will make a statement. And recently when I asked the State Department about this, is the president going to support this declaration of genocide in terms of Armenia, they gave me this answer that kept talking about how like a terrible thing happened and we're thinking about it, but they didn't even in their answer use the word genocide. And that to me was a signal that we cannot necessarily count on Biden using that term as well.
We'll be watching it from here, if and when it comes or not comes, and we'll debate it at that point. But let me move on, Philip, to our last topic, which is if last week was Asia Week, this week was Europe Week. As far as Tony Blinken was concerned, he spent the week in the first in-person ministerial meeting at NATO headquarters since the pandemic, met with the European Union, met with the Belgian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. What was his message, and importantly, how was it received?
His message was the one that the administration came in with and has pushed since, which is alliances are everything, that we face a global challenge from China and from Russia, and that the alliance of first resort is the Transatlantic alliance, and democracies have got to stick together. And that was well received. And he, one can say this is just verbiage, but it was presented well and argued in a way that says, this is good for America as well as being good for Europe. Of course, now I'm being optimistic about this because I think the Transatlantic alliance really does have to work if we are going to preserve some sort of liberal order in some of the world. So I'm perhaps being over optimistic, but I think that there is enough push in the administration's approach and the beginnings of enough concern in Europe about China in particular for this to work. Now, most of the people in my profession, I do it myself, sometimes say, yeah, but what about the Nord Stream pipeline, from Russia? What about, the US is much tougher on China than you Europeans are. What about you Europeans not contributing enough to NATO? So there's a whole list of problems. But Ivo, because you were there during the Cold War, there were always these problems. The first pipeline arguments were between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, back in the early 1980s. There were arguments about Afghanistan, there were arguments. So I am, determined that to be optimistic, but I also think that realistically, I think Biden has done tremendously well outside the US, in that, a lot of people looked at him and thought, well, this is the guy who is just going to replace Trump and make sure that the US becomes a vaguely respectable democracy again. He's not really going to do much, but we don't care. He's hit the ground running. People have been really impressed, in terms of, and there are difficulties, Iran, Tony Blinken had lots of conversations about Iran and getting those negotiations back. And None of it's going to be easy, but I'd say look back through the Cold War. There were lots of problems then. There'll be problems now, but we are beginning the beginning of a new cohesion in the alliance that has been fraying for quite a long time and fraying before Trump. I mean, it was, I think, under pressure with Obama as well.
Bobby, how do you see it? Do you see the administration moving out smartly? Certainly, in the rhetoric is quite different than we saw under Donald Trump. But is in Europe where you are sitting? Is it not only seen as welcome, but is it sustainable? Do they think that this is the new direction and there is a new way to revive this alliance for the longer term?
Well, I think Philip is exactly right. That this was the impression early on was that he would get brownie points just for being not Trump. But he has progressed beyond that, and Blinken's visit with his NATO counterparts was an example of that. That it's more than just a change of guard in the White House. It is that you have now people who believe in the alliance and want to fix it. It's notable that we are hearing much less of the rhetoric from the European side that we heard during the Trump era, which is, we need to be more self-sufficient. We should, have our own military plan, independent or without depending so much on the Americans. You still hear a little of that, but much less than a year ago. So yes, I'm inclined to give Biden very high points for leaning forward on the transatlantic alliance.
While they're trying hard, certainly to reach out to the allies, not only in terms of Blinken's visit, but if you look at the phone calls that are being made by Blinken to allied leaders, and the statements that are coming out that are all co-signed with allied leaders, they really are trying to push this not only in theory, but they're doing it in practice. Do you see this as a very deliberative strategy, and how do you? Is there, there used to be criticism on the part in the U.S. that if we kowtowed to our allies, we wouldn't be strong and enough. Do you see any critique of that yet coming through?
Look, I think it's still early, and I mean, I say that with some reservation, given that I have been writing stories that have been raising questions, and I've been getting criticized because people are like, it's too early. But look, they're speaking what they're saying what they need to say. They're talking the talk. They're coordinating to some extent. They're even coordinating on things like sanctions, right? I mean, just the other day we saw the U.S., the European Union, the UK, and Canada impose coordinated sanctions on some Chinese individuals over the atrocities happening against the Uyghur Muslims. So, I mean, there are these things happening, but at the same time, like, it's a question of like, these types of fissures that exist. So the U.S. also seems determined to stop Nord Stream 2, right? And so that continues to be a major fissure. And the other part of it is, you can talk and coordinate as much as you want, but if you're not having any actual impact on the places that you want to impact, then you have to wonder whether you need some new tools, right? So, right, we impose these sanctions on China along with our European allies, but is that going to actually lead to any change in Chinese behavior against the people that it is oppressing? The same thing with Myanmar. I don't see, these coordinated statements and sanctions and, things that our alliance has put forward against the coup in Myanmar making any difference in the general actions in Myanmar. So again, it's early, and I do think they are making the moves that they said they were going to make, but will it actually in the long run have an impact? I don't know.
I'd like to sort of slightly differ on the question. Obviously, if you impose sanctions against China now, on this or against Myanmar, you're not going to have an effect next week, the week after, probably next year or whatever. But the calculus from a Chinese perspective in Europe until recently was the Europeans do what they're told. That calculus for about a year now, since Hong Kong and whatever, has been changing. Now, when people sit down in Beijing now, they can no longer assume that the Europeans, i.e. the Germans, will do as they're told, and that there will be a cost attached to actions that Beijing takes. Now, that makes, over the long term, that to me is effective diplomacy. That means that you have changed the terms of the relationship with the other side. It's not transformative in itself, but by making them think again, that changes the basis of the relationship. And I think you can see this. I think one of the tests, the real test for me actually won't be about China or Russia. It'll be whether the EU and US can sort out some of their own problems over trade and taxation, etc. If they sort out, for example, the Boeing Airbus fight, which has been going on in the WTO for 15 years and has consumed vast amounts of energy and rhetoric and created lots of ill will, that will make a huge change. It won't change the world tomorrow. But if diplomacy is about changing, shifting the ground and marking out new, if you like, I was going to say battlefields, but new landscapes for the world, then they're heading in the right direction.
George Shultz, one of the great secretaries of state we have ever had, who passed away just a few weeks ago, used to say, "Diplomacy is like gardening. You need to tend it, you need to manage it, and it takes time before the flowers flower." So we will see whether it is effective. However, perhaps next week when we come back for another World Review. In the meantime, I want to thank Bobby Ghosh, Nahal Toosi, and Philip Stevens for their contributions this week. Fantastic discussion. Really enjoyed it, in depth and all. Just what we want. Thank you so much and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.